Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, I have a very special privilege of being joined by Stephen Kapos, a Jewish Holocaust survivor and pro-Palestine activist. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to us, because you are really one of a kind, I would say, that because you're very outspoken about what is happening currently in Palestine. And you yourself, if you were 7 years old when the Nazis invaded your
Yes.
native Hungary, and maybe let's start there. Could you give us your story, where it starts and how you remember the Holocaust?
Yeah. Well, even before the Holocaust reached my hometown, town Budapest, we the war has, to some extent, impacted us by bombing. We were subject to bombing indiscriminately, not especially connected to being Jewish. It's just Allied bombing regularly, and we lived in a block of flats, which was a fairly modern building in the center of Budapest, and it had a designed, very safe air raid shelter, buildings which were put up in the 40s, early 40s, had that requirement. And so I do remember having to go down. And my father had the routine of wrapping the two children, myself at 7 years old, and my sister, who was 5 years younger, at 2 years old. And on sounding of the air raid sirens, we would be wrapped in blankets very quickly, rolled into blankets and taken down into the shelter. And there, I remember hearing the anti-aircraft guns, Bofors guns, they were called, I think made in Sweden, actually. And when the air raid was over and the sirens sounded for the end, the kids would go out, myself included, to the streets to collect shrapnel. This was a kind of competitive game that we would have collection of shrapnels, and whoever had the largest one was a kind of winner. So we turned. I'm illustrating this, how children turn anything, any situation, war even, into games.
And what happened then? I mean, in 44, then the invasion and the Germans coming, and then then shipping off Jews to the concentration camps. How did you survive?
Yeah, well, first of all, what happened? Hungary officially was an ally of Germany. I think, although Hungary was right wing, with a disposition of sympathy and implied alliance with Germany, but it wasn't really firmly in the German camp until it was bribed into it, virtually. How? After the First World War, the Trianon Peace Treaty has revised boundaries of particularly of the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Hungary has lost then 2/3 of its historic territories. All this kind of peripheral areas went to Czechoslovakia, which was then newly created, to Romania, the entire Transylvanian area, which is large, very large, and where my mother's family were farming, went into Romania. And going further south, a part of Hungary went into Serbia, and then another part into Croatia. And even a sliver was taken on the west into Austria. Hungary lost 2/3 of its territories then. And that became a nationalist cause to restore the Hungarian ruling class, I should say, never settled for this as a final state. And when Hitler was promising and actually returning a portion of these lost territories, about half of each, roughly, broadly speaking, and that was the bribe to Hungary to go firmly into the German alliance and join the attack on the Soviet Union. So officially, Hungary was an ally of Germany. The Hungarian ruler was, since 1920, Admiral Horthy, who ruled as a regent. He couldn't found a dynasty because he wasn't Roman Catholic, which was the state religion. And so they gave him the title of regent, but he was a kind of autocratic ruler, settled down to a fairly remote hands-on power, but ultimately decisions were referred to him finally. When we come to 1944, which was very much towards the end of the war, and Germany was quite clearly losing the war by 1944, and much earlier actually, but very definitely by 44. Some countries were which were allied to Germany, like Italy and Romania, were seeking out of the alliance, and successfully. And Romania already declared leaving the alliance, and so did, I think, Italy by then. And the Hungarian leadership, Admiral Horthy and his circle, were also seeking terms on which they could leave the alliance, not to be on the losing side at the very end, and sent unofficial envoys to inquire terms from the Allied forces about how it could be done. This was monitored by the German intelligence, and so Hungary became an unreliable ally. That is why they invaded Hungary. Still, the status was as an allied country, but not trusted. So they invaded in March 1944.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. And the thing, though, is that until 44, the Jewish population of Hungary was relatively safe, weren't they? I mean...
Relatively, yes. That's true. Hungary doesn't have a history of pogroms against Jews like Russia and like Imperial Russia, that is, and Poland. There was and has been for a long time a latent anti-Semitism, but that was mostly social, and there was no impediment, seriously, for professional work for say the Jewish middle class. And in fact, Jews did dominate a number of professions. There were many Jews in the medical profession, and journalists and lawyers, amongst others, and of course industrialists and in commerce generally. So that was all possible. Although Hungary also prided itself, the right that is, of passing the first anti-Jewish racist legislation, the so-called numerus clausus, which limited the number of entries into universities in any particular year. And they prided themselves that this was in the 20s before Mussolini. It was the first legislation against Jews. But for example, my father was a doctor, and during his training in 1 year, he didn't pass the numerus clausus test. He was surplus to requirement. And in that year, he had to continue his studies in Prague. There was a German university in Prague, and that's where he went. And it was, he said it was one of the best experiences he had. He loved it in Prague. And the next year he could rejoin because the numbers worked out okay. And so in the end, he qualified in Hungary as a doctor.
So Hungary wasn't perfect to its Jewish population, but it was far away from what followed next, right? Once the Germans actually
Yes, it was completely different. In 1944, when the Germans did invade in March, in came with them Adolf Eichmann, and he immediately set about the sort of the deportation of the Jewish population as per the German plan. He did have in the right wing of Hungary quite keen supporters, sort of junior ministers, that kind of positions under the region, whose position wasn't very actively involving. He was just turning the other way and allowing the cooperation of the right wing with the Nazis to organize the deportations. And they started in the countryside. They came in March. By the summer, more or less June, July 1944, they had deported 400,000 Hungarian Jews from the countryside straight to Auschwitz, and a special reception platform was built to receive the Hungarian Jews. It was the quickest deportation, and the vast majority of them straight away went into gas chambers. A few people survived for a while because they were put to work. Now, on my mother's side, the family were farming. They had a reasonable sized estate, actually, in Transylvania, in rural Transylvania, not too far from the sort of capital city of Transylvania, which was now called Cluj-Napoca, then in Hungarian was called Kolozsvár. And they were based on a village called Zsombor, which was say an hour or less than an hour's drive from Cluj. Now that part of the family, because about half of Transylvania was reattached to Hungary from Romania. In between the wars, it was part of Romania, but now Hitler reattached under the Vienna Agreement to Hungary. And immediately, the Jews of that part of Transylvania were in much greater danger because the Romanians were far more tolerant about and protective even of that Jewish population compared with Hungary. The Romanian king did not allow the deportation of Romanian Jews, for example. Whereas Admiral Horthy kind of, as I said, turned the other way, didn't actively take part, but allowed his minions to cooperate with the Nazis in deportation. And so my entire Romanian, Transylvanian family fell into the deportations quite quickly.
So you never saw them again?
With one exception. There was a cousin who was then a teenage girl. Actually, she and two sisters, and they were all kind of fairly strong teenagers. And in the selection on arrival to Auschwitz, they were saved and put to work. They worked in the warehouse, in one of the warehouses, selecting clothes that was left behind from the gas chambers, where people were tricked into thinking that they were going into delousing and showers and so on. So they just left all their clothes and shoes at one point with the idea that they will be collecting them later. And of course, they never did. and these girls were put to work in these warehouses to sort these items, because Germany wanted to use. It was a hard winter by then. Wanted to use the warm items that both the civilian population and the army could make use of. And one day, this cousin, her name was Judy, was sorting her parents' clothes,
Oh no.
which must have been a tremendous trauma. All three girls survived Auschwitz, but on the way back, they were in a hostel where they stayed temporarily. And there was a fire. It was never finally established whether that was arson, deliberate fire because of refugees were staying there. But of the three sisters, only one survived. She was at a different level and could jump out, and the others couldn't. So there was one returnee, in answer to your question. From that particular group, there was a returnee from another group, which was based in the south of Hungary and a different branch of the Kremlin.
And you yourself and your parents, like how did it happen in Budapest?
Well, we had different phases, really. To begin with, for the first few months of the German occupation, if you like, when we had German soldiers around the town who didn't act in particularly hostile fashion because they were in an allied country officially. And there was this period when we could we didn't have particularly heavy sanctions against us yet. And I was as a young boy, very much into the paraphernalia of war. All my toys were tanks and field, model field guns and soldiers, etc. And I was very much into the military. And I would salute all soldiers on the streets that I come across. And they would salute back and smile and so on, and including German soldiers. And in fact, I am told that one German officer said, remember, I was at that stage a blonde-haired boy, and he said, "What a pity that this boy isn't German."
Mm.
So that was the first phase. Then came a series of restrictive legislations. Eichmann was stationed in the Buddha Hills in a villa, and he organized the gradual restrictions, or in cahoots with the Hungarian right. But at that stage, the extreme right party, the so-called Arrow Cross Party, which was an out-and-out fascist setup, were not yet in power. They were influential, but not in power. So anyway, and a number of restrictive legislations came rapidly. Things like the amount a Jew could own in terms of land. So the Transylvanian family, when this came in, had to divide the family holdings into individual holdings so as to satisfy this particular requirement. There is evidence of that in the land registry, we later discovered. And you had to start wearing the yellow star as a, and we then realized that serious dangers was around the corner. To evade some of these laws, which restricted all kinds of things, what you could own, not a radio, not I think not even a bicycle. Later, Jews weren't allowed to use trains or these kind of humiliating, restrictive legislation. But around that time, a large number of Jews, including my family, tried to evade some of these laws by taking up Christian religion, converting. And my family, particularly the Transylvanians, had connections to the Calvinist, so-called Reformed Church of Hungary. The Calvinist Church had a majority followers in Transylvania, unlike the rest of Hungary, where Roman Catholicism was the state religion. And there was also another Protestant church called the Evangelical Church, which didn't mean what evangelicalism means in, say, the US today. Yeah. It was just a name. They were Lutherans as opposed to the Reformed Church, which was Calvinist. But these two churches were quite friendly with each other, not so friendly with the Catholics. And an organization was established initially by the Lutheran Church, initially to look after and help those Jews which converted to their religion, which were quite a number, because they weren't racist and they accepted that they are now Christian brothers and sisters and they have to do something for them in their hour of need. And they commissioned one of their pastors, which was called in by his bishop, and said, look, your job is to start this organization of help. And it was called the Good Shepherd Group or organization. And started, as I say, by the Lutheran Protestant Church, and particularly this Pastor Gabor Stelo. And initially, he was trying to organize homes where they were organizing false identities for Jewish children particularly, and that some of their mothers who were included in the organization as nurses. The organization was strongly supported by the Swiss Red Cross. They had a very brave envoy representing them, who organized help and support by the Swiss Red Cross. And these homes were pretended to be, that there was no paperwork to back it, but they were announced to be Swiss protected. They would put Swiss emblems on it, and they say, well, now these homes are extraterritorial to Hungary. Nobody to enter it other than allowed by the Swiss. And I was taken up in October 44 into one of these homes, protected homes. I remember the actual journey up into the Buddha Hills where the villa was, because that was the day when the regent, Admiral Horthy, finally got up courage to declare Hungary's leaving the German alliance formally and officially. He wasn't a particularly good politician. He had no backing for this. He just made an announcement. And of course, as he must have known, the response would be he would be arrested by the Germans, as he was. And his place of dwelling was the palace in the Buddha Hill, the royal palace, which was on top of medieval fortifications, with heavy walls and catacombs and all that, a medieval system of fortification, on top of which a turn of the century palace was built, very elaborate, still in the Austro-Hung Empire days and reflecting that kind of pomp. And it was a huge palace. Anyway, that's where Admiral Horthy dwelt and was the place that I was taken up into as the one of the first, if not the first, such protected home, was very close to the palace, in a kind of very posh area of the Buddha Hills overlooking the Danube and the other side, the flat side, Pest. And we had to go past a German, as I was carried, I was small enough to be carried. Somebody was sent down from the organization, I think a gardener, to simply physically take me up into this home. And we had to go past a German checkpoint and close to the palace. And I remember a field gun trained on the castle. It was the day of the arrest. The person who was taking me had some kind of magic pass. I don't know what it was. I sort of fantasized that he probably visited Germany at one stage or another and got hold of some piece of paper which carried Hitler's signature. Anyway, he flashed this document to the German guard, the checkpoint, and they all stood into attention at seeing this document and waved us on. That was it. That was. And I would love to know what it was, but anyway, it worked like magic. Now, this home where I was taken to was a palatial villa. It was originally the home of the family Hagemacher, who were the big brewers in Hungary. There are two kinds of beer you could have in Hungary, either a Hagemacher beer or a Dreher beer. A Dreher beer you can still get today, not the Hagemacher. I don't know what happened to them. But the Hagemacher family had Swiss connection. They weren't Jewish. They had Swiss connection by family connection, by birth. And at the beginning of the war, they smartly left Hungary to Switzerland and vacated their wonderful villa. The pastor, the Lutheran pastor I mentioned, Gabor Stelo, was a cousin of the Hagemachers. And he was contacted to say, you can use our villa for this purpose of the rescue home. So when I arrived, it was initially into a palatial setting, and then we were distributed into smaller groups in different addresses. But I want to say that that's how it started, this rescue group, the Good Shepherd's Rescue Group. it had 4 organizers. Gabor Stelo was a leader, and there was a Calvinist priest in it, and 2 Jewish lawyers, one an uncle of mine. That formed the organizing group, but supported by this wonderful Swiss envoy who was calling himself von Born. And so they produced the false identities for all these kids. And from the first original villa, Gabor Stelo actively searched and established more and more such homes, so that it became an archipelago of homes. And by the end of the war, altogether, he saved 2,000 children and a few adults.
Wow. Was
The women,
was
the
was
women
your mother and your father, were they among the people saved, or did they not survive?
in different ways. The women of the family were all employed as nurses in these Swiss homes. Boys and girls were separated. My mother was a nurse with a kind of improvised nurse's uniform and Red Cross emblem and some kind of headdress, and, sort of looking like an authentic nurse, in charge of a group of girls. And my younger sister, who was only 2 years old, was with her. I was with a group of boys, the subgroup of which was led by my aunt, Aunt Ergi. But we weren't allowed to recognize the family collection. I was under her protection and direction, along with my 2 cousins, her 2 sons, who were older, 5 years and 6 years older. They weren't allowed to recognize my aunt as their mother either. And then we were all on false papers. And we were supposed to be refugees from the advancing Russians from the east, and some as war orphans, and some as having lost contact with their parents.
And
My father, during this time, was in Belgium, and that's another rather complicated story, because he was part of the Kastner project. Have you heard of Rudolf Kastner? Well, Rudolf Kastner was a very prominent Transylvanian Zionist with very high connections in the Zionist hierarchy in Palestine at that time. He came up when Transylvania, that part of Transylvania, was united back with Hungary. He came up to Budapest, and this is Kastner, and negotiated with the Hungarian Jewish leadership that he could have negotiating rights with the Nazis, and he had a initiative and an agreement eventually with the SS themselves about saving a certain number of mostly Transylvanian and mostly middle class or upper class Jews against delivery of certain goods and trucks via Switzerland to the Germans in return, and with the proviso that the trucks should only be used on the Eastern Front, and against which the Nazis, and this involved Himmler himself, would allow the passage of, in the end it turned out to be 1,600 Jews to Switzerland via Belgium. I don't know why via Belgium, but that's how it was. So they would be transported to Belgium. They're kept separately, and then transferred from Belgium to Switzerland. And the first such transport which was pretty much 1600, was divided there in Belgium. And one part was immediately transferred to Switzerland, and the other was kept waiting until Christmas and then transferred. And my father was in another transport organized by Kastner to follow this. And it was a voluntary entry into this deal. Can you imagine on the German Nazis, the SS's say so, actually going to Belgium and believing that you would be transferred to Switzerland? I wonder how and why people could trust the Germans with this kind of life-threatening deal, but they did because the alternative was worse. That's
Yeah,
why.
I mean, because there's no other way. It's either
Exactly.
true or it's not. Either way, it is what it is. But
Now, Rudolf Kastner set up a collecting camp in Budapest prior to transportation to Belgium. And you could enter this by agreement with Kastner if you were on his, you could join his list with certain provisos, like you had to have a Transylvanian connection or some other reason. And my family did have that connection. So the whole family moved into this camp in Budapest, which was in the grounds of a large institutions of the blind or something like that. And on its grounds, with the sort of wooden huts that were typical of German concentration camps, one of those or several of those in these grounds. And we stayed there for a while, which I remember quite vividly of what that was like, not very.
and
And that camp was guarded by the SS on the outside and had Hungarian police on the inside. And you could leave it. You couldn't enter it except by arrangement, but you could leave it if you change your mind. And so we entered the entire family, these camps, and were temporarily there in these barracks. And I particularly remember being very scared for lavatories. There was an improvised latrine, which I found a very frightening place because it was a great big pit with some planks poised over, which you had to use, and I was very scared of falling. But other than that, the children could play and so on. We were ill, etc. But after a while, for some reason, because every decision in those days was based on rumors, there were no reliable official information, and it must have been some negative news about the reliability of this arrangement. My family left, and that's when I was taken up into the hills. Then my father and uncles also left, but later returned to this camp, and they were in fact transported at Christmas 44 to, or near enough at Christmas 44 to Germany, to Belgium. Unfortunately to them, Hitler discovered this deal. It was behind his back that Himmler arranged, and I think Himmler and Kaltenbrunner were the two negotiators. And Himmler very nearly got the sack from Hitler. He was furious about this arrangement and stopped it. There was no further transfer to Switzerland. All the same, the Germans had some kind of token regard for having made a deal and kept this transport, including my father, in a camp within the camp as hostages status rather than inmates. which meant that they weren't given tattooed numbers. They were allowed to keep their own clothes, and I had a degree of kind of self management. My father worked as a doctor for this camp, for example.
And they survived in that camp. And
Yes. Eventually, with the advancing Russians, they were transferred to Theresienstadt. I don't know if their relative privileges remain there. I doubt it. But Theresienstadt was a milder sort of camp compared with the others. Although it was waiting room for Auschwitz, from time to time they would transfer on to Auschwitz. But this was so late in the war, they didn't have time for that. And that's why my father was liberated.
so you have that experience and you remember this so clearly. When we go fast forward to the present day and we look at what's happening in Gaza and we look at the way Israel developed. I mean, you were there when Israel was founded, and you see the development of this country over the last 70 years. How does it make you feel, and how do you relate to it?
Before I turn to that, I just want to add to the story of that period, is that not only have we had the experience of hiding and danger from discovery, but unfortunately, where we were physically, in very close proximity of the royal castle in this area, that was where the final stand of fighting between the Germans and the invading Soviet Red Army was fought out. It was the epicenter of the fighting of Budapest. And the front line moved through us, and we had to relocate several times into uncertain new locations, etc. I'm mentioning this because the two things overlaid on top of each other is very important background for empathy with the Gazan experience, because we had the fighting, the total destruction around us, and the displacement several times. So what I then later seen on the screens in Gaza kind of rhymed or echoed with that experience. So it was the danger plus the wartime, and it was house to house fighting.
And can you relate to the Zionists who say that the experience of the Holocaust is the reason why currently the violence is happening? That Israel needs to be a place that for the Jews, a country for the Jews, where the Jews will be safe forever from this kind of persecution, and they need to have that land, and the Palestinian population is a problem in that in that concept.
Yeah.
How do you view that?
Well, again, just to start with a bit of background, Hungary, in the times of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the position of Jews was different from some other Eastern European countries because, as an official policy, the Habsburgs and the ruling classes realized the usefulness of the educated Jewish population to use them in the transformation from feudalism to capitalism. They were, therefore, they had a policy of integration for them. A very good example of that is their encouraging and initiating that Jews should change names from recognizably Jewish names into indigenous sounding names, so that in their daily work they would not be identified and subject to prejudice, etc. So that was official policy. And by and large, the educated, particularly middle class Jewish population, embraced this completely, and they were all integrationists, and indeed have had, by and large, those who were with any ability, good careers in their professions. Like my father was a GP to begin with, and later trained on as a psychoanalyst. By 44, he was a psychoanalyst. As a result of this, there was very little influence of the Zionists. There was only a tiny group of Zionists in Hungary, and they were regarded by the Jewish population that I knew, and the educated Jewish people, as freaks and extremists, not to be taken seriously and have nothing to do with them. And so that's very different from, say, the experience of Poland or some other places.
How do you view them today? How do you view Zionism? How do you view the results of Zionism that we're seeing now?
Yeah. So, in other words, my family didn't have any Zionist influence and inclinations, and nor did I see any around in Hungary. Now, I sort of became aware of what Zionism was when I visited a part of my family who, when after Second World War, Transylvania was reattached to Romania. Suddenly they became part of Romania again. And eventually, under the Romanian communist rule, they were, inverted commas, sold to Israel. The one place you were allowed to leave the country was by a deal with the Israeli authorities towards Israel. And Israel was paying so much, I don't know how many thousands of dollars per head of Jews allowed to leave. And then a big part of my family, the Transylvanians who then lived partly in Transylvania or in Bucharest by then, left for Israel, Haifa. So when I visited them, it was then that I was first really confronted with what Zionism was. And I was horrified because it was clearly extremely racist set up there. I just want to mention one particular example of an experience. I was part of a little group organized to a kind of tourist group to visit Jerusalem from Haifa. And in this group, improvised for the purpose, were some visiting middle-aged to elderly Jewish people from the US. And there was this particular lady, I remember, who was kind of elderly. And we were in this group about to leave, and there was a Israeli soldier, a young soldier with machine gun, etc., standing by. And when she saw this Jewish soldier, she broke down crying to say that I lived a day when I could see a Jewish soldier. So
which year was that?
This was before the 67 war.
65, something around.
63, 65. I understood that this was a reaction to their memories of pogroms and humiliation, and Israel and a Jewish army meant some kind of fundamental liberation to them. And I could understand the emotional beginnings of that feeling for Israel. That was a good example of it. It was not pretended, it was completely genuine. To some extent, my own relations had that, not quite so dramatically, as well. And they were subjected to the propaganda after they arrived in Haifa. So I can understand the roots of this sort of feeling and Zionist attitude. What I cannot understand is that once you start seeing what that meant to the local population, that it wasn't an empty place where you suddenly could build a new state, but you were actually taking the land of some other people and also subject them to unjust treatment all the time and treat them as enemies. That I found revolting. And unfortunately, I found that members of my family, almost without exception, became racist in this way. They talked about the Palestinian, they called them Arabs, as a not unequal, a lower species who had to be kept down. They bought into the, I think, artificially created fears that the Palestinians, unless they were kept sort of rather forcibly down, would chase the Jews into the sea. They often came with that image that's unless they were vigilant and violent, that what would happen to them, which was a result of continuous propaganda, and it was tragic. And even the cousin who I explained was sorting her parents' clothes and eventually survived and came back was racist as much as any of the others. And I found that terrible, really.
And
And
she could never relate the suffering of the Arabs, of the Palestinians, then to her own suffering that she went through as a child.
they had no empathy for the local people. They, somehow they bought into this awful racism, which actually was leveled against the Jews in some countries, of not equal, not to be taken seriously, not to, they weren't of equal value at all. Today in Hungary and Czech Republic, the same fate is visited on the Roma population. They are almost a replacement Jews in some respect.
Yeah.
Because they're not integrated. They regarded without they not taken as individuals, but people who just always given to thieving and and don't work and that there is an apartheid against them in practice.
And this it's a very European sentiment, isn't it? And that was transplanted and actually then implanted in Israel or in Palestine, isn't it? And continues there to this day. The thing to me is that I don't understand how people can look at Gaza and not see a concentration camp. I mean, it's so clearly it functions like a concentration camp, an extermination camp by the time you started bombing it, mass bombing it. How did that? How did you then perceive these last years of that new genocide that we saw? Did it evoke those feelings in you?
Yeah, yes, of course. Because of my wartime experience as well, I had been sort of reliving almost those feelings and dangers. I have to emphasize that at the time this was happening to me as a 7-year-old boy, I wasn't afraid. It's difficult to understand now for me because the situation was extremely dangerous all the time, either from the fighting or the persecution and the danger of discovery, etc. But the truth is that I was too young to really understand it as it was happening. And in retrospect, a few years later, I did realize how humiliating and dangerous various situations were. One particular episode around Christmas was when we still in hiding, but Budapest already surrounded by Soviet forces, and the last fight was about to start um, around Christmas time. But the German army still celebrated Christmas in a very formal way, and they invited us to be their guest, or group of um, Jewish boys in hiding. And that was a very dangerous situation to be in, but I didn't realize it was dangerous. It was, I remember the setup, which was very beautiful, long white table. This is wartime conditions, remember? And nicely decorated Christmas tree at the end, and a great swastika flag at the end of the room, sort of hung almost from the ceiling, and a very depressed atmosphere because we were seated, one German soldier, one Jewish boy, one German soldier, one Jewish boy.
They didn't know you were Jewish boys, right?
Of course not.
Yeah.
That's why we were invited. But there was a danger of discovery that particularly the adults in charge were aware of. If a Jewish boy was asked to be taken to the loo, and a German soldier taking him would discover that the boys are circumcised, that would give away our cover.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my aunt, who was in charge, was very, very worried that something like this would happen. It didn't happen.
So
The-
your life then there was filled with these kind of very dangerous experiences, and we can only imagine how extremely dangerous Gaza must be, right? And the
yeah.
life of Palestinians in general, also in the West Bank, right, being under constant repression and danger to be killed. How do you explain to yourself that you develop this kind of obvious kind of connection between the suffering of these people, like that are 80 years apart and geographically apart, but obviously experience very similar things, and that your cousin couldn't, that she never, that she obviously didn't make that connection.
Well, the big difference is what influences were we were under. Um, the cousin I mentioned arrived in Israel in, I don't know, early 50s from Romania, and immediately under the drip influence of uh, extreme nationalist propaganda and propaganda which emphasized the dangers all the time from the Arabs,
Mm.
not Palestinians, Arabs, and how they were all bent on killing Jews, etc. If you hear it all the time, it will work on. And at the same time, I myself have completely different influences. First of all, my father was very enlightened, and as I say, and as well as a qualified doctor, he was a psychoanalyst. When he returned from Belgium, and by the way, from the moment he was taken until the day of his return, we had no news of him. That was an agonizing experience. But when he and my uncles all returned from Theresienstadt, not Belgium, because they were transferred to Theresienstadt, eventually returned in the summer of 45, they all joined the Communist Party because they felt that the only true resistors in their experience was the Communist Party, which was, by the way, illegal in Hungary. There was a brief Hungarian Soviet, if you like, in 1920, very much on a pattern of the Soviet, the Russian Revolution, rather. And there was a brief communist rule, and briefly a Hungarian Red Army even organized against the attacking surrounding countries. But they didn't have very much chance, and it was a short-lived thing, sort of less than about half a year at the most. And the Communist Party, in response to that, was banned. And right after the brief communist rule, the incoming right-wing forces, supported by the Western powers, particularly France, at that time, started with what is described as the White Terror, of a lot of pogroms and killings. The only pogroms that I think Hungarian Jews experienced was then, because the communist rule and Jewishness somehow was conflated, and they went these marauding white armed groups went from village to village and sought out the communists and the Jews, and there was a lot of bloody retribution in response to the brief communist period.
And despite that memory, your father and your uncle, they joined the communists in 45, and because it was the resistance, against the
Exactly.
Germans and
That was the basis of. Now, my experience in as a teenager was entirely under the communist regime, and although it was with also almost continuous hardships and austerity living, and increasingly autocratic. On the question of race, we had completely different education than the drip propaganda in Israel. So it's hardly surprising that I was anti-racist. That was the influence I had. It's an interesting detail that the word for Jew in Hungarian is Żydó. So I think it's the same in Poland, similar. And that word was banned officially because it was regarded a racist mark.
Oh, really? Okay.
And you could be arrested for using that word. In the same way, try to think of it in the same way as Negro is not and non-acceptable, and in fact something that you can legislate for if people using it in a malicious way.
So the communists tried to, for all the flaws, they did try to root out these kind of racisms of the population against each other. They tried to create an egalitarian society.
That's right. Yeah. Equally poor living for everybody, because an unfortunate overemphasis was on fast industrialization. They were kind of copying the Soviet experience unnecessarily, and they did not use the strengths of the country, which was a very successful, mainly agricultural country with various good exports in that line, And instead they were building great steelworks where Hungary had neither raw material for it or energy for it. They were just under the dictate of the Soviets, which tried to create mini Soviet policies in all the satellite countries very unwisely. Anyway, that's another story. But but go on.
Just in the last 5 minutes, because we do need to come to an end. Like, I just wanted one more, like, your views on what is happening to Palestine and how you also relate that to yourself. And you go to the street, you protest against the genocide in the UK. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I just want to mention that during my experience of the Holocaust, and the war, I was very much aware of the kind of invisible pain that is involved, such as the relocations, which some families cannot manage because of a disabled member of the family. My Transylvanian family got transported to Auschwitz because they turned down some local Romanian peasants, workers, offer to take them by horse and cart on secret passages towards the Romanian border, where they would have been saved, probably. They couldn't accept this offer because there was a disabled member of the family who couldn't take that journey, they judged. And all of them perished. This kind of thing is not very visible. You can see the destruction and the killing, but there are this and similar pains and difficulties that we had gone through, and I recognized that the Gazans also have as problems. The frequent relocations without transport. Sometimes it just couldn't be carried out because of disabled members, and also just the mental agony of having to make life-defining, life and death decisions based on information from your enemy or based on rumors. Like my father, sort of based on rumors, accepting a deal with the Nazis and trusting it. Similarly, people in Gaza had to trust a statement that you got to go to area X, which is the protected or safe area, which of course turned out to be not to be. But you have no reliable information, and yet you have to make decisions affecting the entire family. The pain of all this, and similar, a few others, which are not totally visible on the screen, I was very aware of because of the experience we've gone through.
Did you imagine that European governments would ever support something like this again? I mean, to me, it comes as quite a shock. Although I must say, I just didn't pay enough attention. But I didn't think we would.
No, I agree. It's very hard to explain. Very hard to explain, and there's no doubt that it will be regarded by future generations as criminal. The attitude of all the European governments, and the division between the government and their people in almost all European countries. I think in this country, about 70% of the people would be supporting the Palestinian cause, and yet the government is actually partnering a genocide.
The UK is part and parcel of the genocide.
Absolutely, and all other European countries as well. France. Today there is the exception with Spain, I believe, but most of them, and that people are not in support of it, of what the governments are doing. So there is this divide. It's in a longer term, it's an insupportable situation.
It's
It will end at one point.
it's just so frightening, right? That the Holocaust is, of course, a crime of many, many people collaborating. Many countries, many governments collaborating to make it possible, state borders crossed, people massively migrating, and so on. And the current genocide is, again, the collaboration of all of these countries, some of them just looking away, and some of them actively helping and lending a hand, and then cooperating in the extermination of a people.
Absolutely, it will turn out to be regarded by a later consensus as criminal, and those in power today who will be still available for trial will find themselves in court having to defend what they've been doing.
If you could talk, if you could speak to a 7-year-old Palestinian boy in Gaza, what would you tell him? And for the future, if he survives the way you did, what would you tell him? Like, so that this doesn't repeat one more time.
That the future holds tremendous number of fundamental changes yet, and we have to hope that some of the changes coming will be in a good direction. If I think what I experienced since I was 7 years old, a brief period of democracy, then communist rule, then an uprising in Budapest and Hungary, then replacing into a totally different country and environment, and then the activism, huge changes all along the line. You cannot foresee it when you are 7 years old, obviously, but that there can be fundamental changes to come, and we have to make it positive changes, and it's possible.
Very wise words. Fundamental changes will come, and it's up to us to make it good changes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you. These are very, very hopeful words. So, Stephen, people who want to read more from or about you, or follow you somewhere, is there any place where you regularly publish something, or where you have?
I think a number of my earlier interviews, which cover much the same plus a bit more, or slightly different aspects. There are interviews available in Instagram and YouTube. I had interviewed Double Down News, which is an extensive one. I had an interview with Owen Jones, which might be of interest, and so on.
I will try to find them and link them in the description box of this video, and I will, of course, send you a copy once this one is out.
Thank you.
Stephen Kapos, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.